All right, so Ash just touched on one of the three major problems we had seen. There was an increase and intensifying of a lot of issues, such as homelessness, lack of resources due to the budget cuts, and an increase in HIV, AIDS, and STD increases. Another major problem we had found was that LGBTQ youth, their problems were not being prioritized, and they were not really being spoken about. So the youth really had nowhere to go if they were having an issue.
Rudy, can I ask you to just speak a little bit more about that not being prioritized part? What do you mean by that?
Well, the youth felt that their issues weren't being spoken about, like they were pretty much going under the radar. So during the survey, we had actually asked, like, do you feel that the problems are being noticed? Are they being talked about? Are they being prioritized? Are they trying to be solved? And a lot of them said no, they're not. And the last issue that we had come up with was that, oh, sorry a second, almost forgot. The last problem we had come across is that the strategies that were being used to solve these problems, they were not building the power and leadership qualities of those youth that were being affected, and that the youth may or may not have been involved with that process to try and end that issue that they were having. So Fierce had come up personally with like 3 recommendations, and me and Ash are gonna talk about those 3.
So our first recommendation, after seeing how the mainstream movement sometimes doesn't always support us, is really recognizing that we need to empower LGBTQ youth leaders by really prioritizing political consciousness and political education in different organizations, and really teaching organizing skills so that youth, LGBT youth of color, can actually organize themselves and address these issues and concerns. And we haven't really seen that happening across the nation. You want to speak about the second one?
So another one that we came across or come up with was to try and get more youth and community organizing, like have more summits like Creating Change. And so instead of once a year, have it more often and have a lot of more youth organizers, because a lot of the organizations we had surveyed, they ran campaigns, but they weren't solely organizing.
And then this is one more generally for the mainstream LGBT movement, which is in this room. Shout out to the movement. Is that we want to see development of youth-led organizing agenda, and also we want to shift the national LGBTQ movement and shift the priorities to things that affect all of our communities. So access to housing would be an example. Safety from violence would be another one. Access to safe public space would be another one. And then also, we're also asking that more progressive organizations also prioritize LGBT youth of color issues, and also that we continue to focus on racial and economic justice in this movement for LGBT justice as well.
It's really groundbreaking work, the survey, and so I hope everybody will get a chance to go look at it and dig into it. Gabe, you wanted to say something?
Oh yeah, I wanted to jump in a little bit. And if you notice on that survey, the problems that we find to be the most affecting people today is homelessness, and they had just listed them. And unfortunately, the least ones were having to do, such as don't ask, don't tell policy and gay marriage. And we often forget that marriage is historically an institution of heterosexual male property of the woman's body. And has also introduced heteronormative oppression into First Nations people. So these are issues to be aware about, and how our communities are not being properly represented, as they said in the mainstream gay movement.
Well, as you can see, we jump right into it. Well, so while we're on the topic of the mainstream G movement, as you put it, and how it does or does not represent these issues, everybody else, what do you think? We hear Fierce's recommendations for what we should be prioritizing. If marriage isn't it, what else should it be? Does anybody else in the panel from their organization want to chime in?
Well, it wasn't just Fierce's recommendations, but rather 62 organizational recommendations from around the nation. And like some of the major problems that had come up was trans and gender nonconforming violence, homelessness, the increase in STDs and AIDS, and a whole bunch of other things. And a lot of people actually agree that those should be prioritized. So it's not just one organization, but rather a nation.
Certainly. But for any other folks on the panel, from your organization's perspective or from your individual perspectives, what do you think? Are we doing a good job at the top level? Do these organizations that they've surveyed, do they represent what you're seeing as well? Charlotte?
I definitely think that they are representing what Bagley has experienced, Massachusetts being one of the first states to legalize gay marriage. In that time when we were like protesting and waiting for things to be passed, like administratively, like the youth involved saw a growing sort of disparity in terms of like losing funding, and yet the mainstream movements were willing to like take sort of our labor in terms of like canvassing, like being a body there at protest, and yet we saw no return back. And so that made it like really hard for us as an organization, because we want to support the greater community as well, but it didn't feel like the greater community was supporting us back. And like in local schools and things like that, there was an increase in like hate crimes, and in another study, it was shown that queer youth were more likely to commit or attempt suicide than their heterosexual counterparts, due to the sort of increased visibility of the queer community. And
that's
so
in the course of the campaign.
That was in the course of the campaign and like the protest and then the legalization. And I'm not sure if it's sort of plateaued or not at this point, but a lot of us were sort of dumbfounded, like a lot of the youth. It's like we put so much into giving into these campaigns, and nobody seemed to notice that there was like an increase in like homelessness and drug use, and that we were losing a lot of our resources.
I'd also like to say that you mentioned hate crimes too. The Matthew Shepard Hate Crime Act that was passed. I think it's really important that when we look at these issues, although they are important to certain queer people and queer communities, we have to remember there are a lot of other dynamics to them. So for example, when we think of hate crimes in prison and incarceration, like queer people and trans people of color who are going to those institutions and being oppressed. So when we address these issues individually or with organizations, I think it's really important to not only keep that in mind, but have that on the front line of our agenda and our action. And I know that for our organization at Texas GSA Network, we help schools from all over the city and the state, and specifically in Austin, to not just help like gay and straight people like come together, but also think about like racial justice and economic justice, segregation in cities and how that's difficult in terms of the public school system. And so just a point to really think about every side of an issue.